Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to our second episode of Wrongful Convictions and Cold Cases. I really enjoyed our conversation last week with Gilbert King talking about the Bone Valley podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking with award winning journalist and author George Jared about one of the most famous criminal cases in U.S. legal history, the case of the West Memphis Three. No journalist has covered the West Memphis Three saga more extensively than George Jared, who is also the author of the book Witches in West Memphis, which chronicles how three men, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., fought the Arkansas judicial system after they were convicted in the horrible deaths of three 8-year-old boys in West Memphis, Arkansas, over 2 decades ago. As George mentions in the intro to his book, observers likened the case to a witch hunt, similar to a series of trials in Salem, Massachusetts, more than 300 years ago. Many innocent residents in Salem were accused of witchcraft and were executed as a result of those accusations. It's an incredible and heartbreaking saga. I think you will enjoy our conversation. We have a lot to talk about. Let's begin. All right, George, it is so good to have you here on this podcast with me. I've been looking forward to this. We first met in CrimeCon last year in Las Vegas, CrimeCon 2022. I saw your presentation on the West Memphis Three. Hadn't heard about the case before then. We met, hit it off, became fascinated about the case. And I want to kind of dive into it. Are you game?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
You know, your audience for sure knows, all the background details. Mine may not. But in 1993, three 8-year-old boys were found dead in West Memphis, Arkansas. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. And three young teenagers were ultimately arrested, charged, and convicted of the triple murders. Jason Baldwin, who was 16 at the time, Jesse Miskelly, he was 17, and Damian Eccles, 18 years old. Those three guys who got convicted, those teenagers, became known as the West Memphis Three. They were ultimately convicted. Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly were sentenced to life in prison. Damian Eccles, am I correct, was sentenced to the death penalty?
Yes.
Okay. And to complete this, setting the stage, the three of them were released from prison in 2011. They gave Alford pleas, which, you want to explain what an Alford plea is?
Sure. Back in the 1970s, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Alford versus North Carolina that a person has the constitutional right to go into a courtroom and say that they are innocent of a crime, but at the same time, they can acknowledge that the state potentially has enough evidence to convict them if it goes to trial. It's kind of a rarely used legal maneuver, but it's kind of weird. A lot of people hear it and they're like, what? But yeah, you can do that in this country.
Yeah, I have had no experience with it, and I think it also prevents you, if you do an Alford plea, from bringing a subsequent civil suit against, law enforcement, et cetera. So there is no ramifications for that. But obviously, they were released from prison and they've been out. And it's amazing. I was looking back at this, the amount of media coverage this case has gotten. There were 3 documentaries, a trilogy called Paradise Lost, 3 versions. There was on HBO. There was a scripted version called Knots Landing, apparently with Colin Firth and Reese Witherspoon.
No, that was Devil's Knot.
Devil's Knot. What did I call it? Knots Landing is an old TV show.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Donna Mills' TV show. You're right. Devil's Knot. And then there was this Amy Berg documentary based on a book. That was, what was that one called?
It's called West of Memphis.
West of Memphis, right. And The best one of all is a book called Witches in West Memphis, written by George Jarrett. I bought it on Amazon. I encourage everybody to go out and buy this book. I read it again the second time. When this murder happened, you were working where?
When the murders actually happened, I was in high school, and I had just moved to the South from Oregon. I was a teenager, and I remember hearing about it, and I remember getting on a map and looking up West Memphis, Arkansas, and it was hours away because it was the thing of it was like you might remember Andy back in the 80s and early 90s. There was a term called satanic panic where people were scared to death that these Satanists were running around and, having rituals out in cemeteries and committing all these barbaric crimes. And so that I kind of grew up in that a little bit of that cultural era. I think there were some TV shows dedicated to it. And of course, it all was a bunch of nonsense. But, at that time, we all thought it was really happening.
And so then how do you get involved? Explain your kind of like, your employment history. How do you get involved in covering this case?
My original goal when I went to college, I wanted to be a lawyer. And then my senior year of college, when I was starting to vet law schools and thinking about the scope of my life, I met a lot of miserable and poor lawyers.
Yeah, I can't say you didn't make the right choice. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I decided to take a pause, and I thought, okay, maybe I'll just get a job and make some money for a year, and make up my mind. And there was a local newspaper that needed a reporter, and of course, I had done a ton of writing in college, and so I went in and did a writing test, and the editor was like, okay, I'll go ahead and give you a shot. He goes, come here for a year, I'll clean up your writing, I'll let you cover cops in court so that you can get a feel and a flavor for the courtroom. And he goes, then a year from now, he goes, I know what's going to happen. You're going to go to law school, and that's just going to be the way it happens. And 7 months into that job, I got my first murder case that I covered, and it just really haunted me. And so from that point on, I decided I was going to stay a journalist. I did take a couple of other minor jobs through the years to make some money in marketing and things like that, but I've always kind of been in that field. Well, the Great Recession started to hit in 2008. And I told my wife, I said, I need to get just a steady job because I was in sales and marketing at that time. And so I got a job working at the Jonesboro Sun, which was the largest newspaper kind of in the Mid-South near Memphis. And the West Memphis Three were tried in Craighead County. And that courthouse is literally like a block from the newspaper I was working at. And so one day I get a call from my boss, and she said, well, you're the fourth guy in line today, but we need somebody to cover a hearing for the West Memphis Three. And I was like, okay, cool, I can do that. Well, I was at my daughter's softball game, and I got off the phone with her, and I looked at my friend, and I said, what's the West Memphis Three? And
little did you know.
Little did I know. And so I did a little research, and I had seen the first documentary by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, which was Paradise Lost. And so I went to court the next morning, and Jason Baldwin was there. And I'll never forget, I was looking at his hands, thinking to myself, what have those hands done? Because at that time,
right?
Yes,
right.
And at that time, Dennis Reardon, who was Barry Bonds' attorney in the Balco steroids case, he's one of the best attorneys I've ever seen in action ever. He was kind of like a pro bono lawyer for the West Memphis Three at the time, and they were there. They were there settling some issues. They were getting ready to do Baldwin and Miss Kelly's Rule 37 hearings. And for people who don't know it, I won't bore you with all the magnitude of details. Basically, it's your last chance in state court to get a new trial. And what you do is you go in and you basically throw everything up against the wall and see if the judge will buy any argument, any new evidence, anything that you can possibly bring to the table that would warrant new trials. And so I was there for 20 minutes. I went back to the newspaper, wrote the story for the Jonesboro Sun and the Associated Press. And that was it. I thought, okay, I'm done with this. Well, then the reporter that we had that had covered it from the beginning, he left the newspaper. And because I had covered one 20-minute hearing, I was suddenly our expert on staff. And
Wow.
so the next 2 years, I get to spend covering these lengthy Rule 37 hearings.
So what year was that when you first went to that first court hearing?
2008.
All right, so 2008. So they got convicted in 1994, and they got released in 2011. So you got in towards the last few years. And then did you write over 100 articles about the case?
Yes, I always wondered why Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, because when they would come to town, because they were filming Paradise Lost 3 during this period, and they would always meet up with me. We'd go eat lunch. I'd take them around. They interviewed me for about a day and a half at the courthouse at one point, and I always wondered why they would call me. And Amy Berg, in fact, from west of Memphis, I met with her several times in consulting with that documentary. And they told me that I had written, even at that time, this was probably 2009-ish, that I had already written more about it than anybody.
You are. I mean, you are the foremost expert on the case, hands down. I mean, 100 articles. And I tell you what, being a lawyer, you're in court watching court hearings. So you're seeing firsthand body language, what people look like, the judge. I mean, like, nobody has the perspective you do. And even when I went to CrimeCon and saw you in your presentation, you were on stage with some other people. I mean, to me, man, this was like your show. You could have had a whole 2-hour time slot, just you, with your depth of knowledge. So I read your book. I've got enough knowledge to be dangerous. So I want to ask you some questions and walk through some things. All right.
Sure.
All right. So in reading this, the boys were 8 years old. They're found. Is it like described as like a drainage ditch? Explain to me where the bodies are found.
Okay. So the boys lived in a neighborhood in West Memphis, and this neighborhood abutted to this like kind of wooded area that had a drainage creek. You got to understand, West Memphis, what surrounds West Memphis, Arkansas, is all these ag fields like soybean, cotton. It's an agricultural area, and West Memphis is very unique in all the United States. It's the pinch point where I-40 meets I-55, and so more big truck traffic goes through West Memphis than any other town in the country.
Jeez.
And what goes along with that is there's a lot of transients. There's a lot of drugs that get moved through there. And so there, near where these boys lived, there was a series of like truck stops. And so there was a lot of transients that would be out in this kind of wooded area, but kids would go in there and play, and they called it Robin Hood Hills. And there was like a dirty creek that went through it that was filled with turtles and all sorts of other aquatic stuff. And the three boys weren't supposed to play down there. Their parents had gotten onto them in the past, but you know how 8-year-old boys are. This is 1993. So, you know, they're out riding their bikes on this beautiful sunny day. And sometime during that day, they vanish.
All right. And so this wooded area would be about how far from like the nearest boy's house? Give me a like ballpark. Like,
It abutted the neighborhood, so it's fairly close. I mean, we're not talking like miles or anything like that. We're talking under a mile for sure, and probably even closer than that.
so if you rode your bike back in there to like where they were found, you could ride your bike back there pretty quickly.
Fairly quickly, yes.
All right, so let's pause on that. So that's where they're found. The cause of death is what?
One boy they think may have bled out, but they died from like blunt force trauma to the head, and then they drowned in the creek.
All right, so blunt force trauma and drowning. And when the bodies are found, are they naked?
Yes, they were nude, and they were bound ankle to wrist with their own shoelaces.
So that's interesting. So basically, hogtied is what they called it.
Yes.
With their own shoelaces.
Yes.
Were their bikes also found nearby?
Yes, they were.
Were they in the water?
Somebody asked me that the other day. I think one of them might have been. I think one was up on the bank a little bit, but don't quote me on that part exactly. I do know that all their clothes were shoved into the mud of the creek with, like, somebody took a stick and jammed the clothes into the creek, but they did find them.
Am I correct? There's no evidence of sexual assault?
None. And that was one of the biggest problems in the original trials for these guys, was that the state medical examiner, a guy named Dr. Frank Peretti, while he acknowledged on the stand at the Rule 37 hearings that there was no evidence for sexual assault, and, you know, not to be too graphic, but there's a couple of pieces of evidence you can use to prove sexual assault on a child that young.
Mm-hmm.
The first would be anal tearing or bruising, which none of the three boys had that. The presence of semen. There was no semen found on or in the boys anywhere. Or if you found like the presence of an STD.
Yeah.
And so one thing that the state and the defense forensic pathologists all agree is that there was no evidence of a sexual assault at all. However, in the original trials, Dr. Peretti left the jurors with the impression that it was still possible, which was egregious. I mean, he should
Mm,
never have said that, and he
mm.
did. And of course, the Baldwin, Miss Kelly, and Eccles, their attorneys should have called for a mistrial just based on that alone.
So explain to me, you've got these 3 8-year-old boys found naked in this creek, hogtied. How do the Memphis Three get implicated? Why them? Like, how do they get on the police radar screen?
Because at the crime scene, when the boys' bodies were found on May 6th, they were found the next day after they vanished. One of the guys that was there at the scene was a social worker named Steve Jones. Steve had been a counselor to Damien Eccles, who was a troubled teen for sure. There's no question about that. He says at the scene that he said, "I guarantee you that Damien Eccles had something to do with this." And
What?
so, yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And so, like less than 24 hours after the bodies are found, even though they have no connection to Damien Eccles at all, there's no known connection between him and these 3 boys. The police have already interviewed him once, and there's actually a picture that they took of him, and I actually have the picture. And I tell people all the time, Andy, the problem is that let's say I murder someone. Okay, let's say there's like 5 witnesses. Okay, if there's 5 witnesses, they go to the police and say, "Hey, George murdered this person." Okay, that makes sense. I'm a primary suspect. Or let's say they get to the murder victim and there's some piece of, like overwhelming evidence, like my driver's license and my gun are both sitting there. Okay, well then, again, I'm a primary suspect because of that. The third way I could become a primary suspect is if I just walk into the police station and say, "Hey, I did it." Well, they didn't have any of that stuff. And so for them to hone in on him so early without even testing any evidence, it makes it clear.
That blows my mind. I mean, this social worker says, "I think Damien Eccles has something to do with this." Let's pause. Damien Eccles is 18 years old, okay? And from what I can tell, had, troubled kid. What was his record? Like some vandalism and some petty crime.
Yeah, minor.
This
Yeah.
is a triple murder of 8-year-old boys who are found naked and hogtied. I mean, this is some serious business. It blows my mind that anybody could just implicate somebody out of who has no connection to the crime. That is, first of all, that is outrageously irresponsible. Second of all, I can't believe that it carried any weight with law enforcement, like that you would actually think that had any merit. So then Damien Eccles gets on the radar screen, and then is that how they basically start looking at his 2 friends?
Yeah, and here's what's ironic is he wasn't friends with Miss Kelly. He was just somebody that was known, like they were around the same age, and they knew each other because they lived in the same trailer park, but they weren't friends at all. And they brought Damien in for questioning several times, and there was nothing there. There's nothing that he didn't say or do anything that would indicate that he was involved. And Jason Baldwin, the same thing. And then finally, they decided to bring Jesse in, and Jesse has an IQ of 72.
Right, I read that.
And he gives a confession. And Andy, I tell people all the time, people confess to crimes all the time that they don't commit. Well, his confession was so bad the first time when he was telling the story. Like he said, the boys, that they kidnapped them early in the morning and then they took them out in the woods. And of course, that wasn't true. The boys were in school that day. And you can just, if you read the confession, you can see where the detective is just stepping him towards the right answers. But what's really interesting, Andy, is he also steps him towards an answer that is absolutely wrong. And one of those answers is he says that the boys were raped. Okay.
Mm.
So then they weren't raped. The defense and the state both agreed that they were not raped, but that was what Miss Kelly confessed to. And some people will point to the fact that Jesse confessed more than once. He confessed 3 or 4 times, and his confessions got a little bit better as he went along. But again, he still said that they were sexually assaulted because in 1993 and then in 94 when the trials happened, that's what everybody thought. And I asked his attorney at the time, who's now a judge, and I asked him one day, I just went to his office. I just said, "Hey, I want you to explain to me why Jesse's confessions got better." And he started laughing. He goes, Well, because during the trial, he started learning what actually happened. So he started getting better at confessing later on, because he actually had it,
Oh,
he was exposed to actually what had happened to the boys.
I mean, I understand the social worker mentions Damien Eccles. They interview him. Why does Jesse why does he get interviewed? How does that happen?
Basically, what they were doing is they were running around interviewing any and every teenager that lived in Lakeshore, this trailer park where all these guys lived. And so, they were just basically like throwing darts on a wall, hoping one of them would land. And, Jesse being a very low IQ, and I can tell you right now, Andy, I've been around Jesse a lot. He is virtually special needs. And I'm not kidding you. If anybody met Jesse Misskelley Jr. and talked to him, like even people who don't have experience in a courtroom or with the law or police or law enforcement, it's disgusting. I literally said one time when I was in court in earshot of the prosecutor, I said, so this guy right here, and I was pointing at Jesse, this was a credible witness in a murder case.
Wow. You know, when you look at false confessions, and I've talked a lot about this a lot on my podcast, Starved Rock Murders with Andy Hale, with my client Chester Weger, who, allegedly confessed. Well, he confessed falsely to a triple murder in 1960. You've got somebody who's young, you've got somebody who's uneducated, you've got somebody with a low IQ, you've got all these factors. Did he? I can't imagine he even understood Miranda rights.
Andy, I'll tell you a fun little fact. He didn't even understand what an attorney was. He thought that his attorney was a cop that was just working with him.
Wow.
And then finally, after about 3 or 4 months, because Dan told me the story, one thing that Dan said, he was getting ready for this. And of course, Dan thinks that he was picked specifically because he was 27 years old and he had never tried a felony case ever. And so he thinks that they picked him because of his inexperience. And he thought they were he told me, he said, my whole plan was we were going towards a plea deal. He's going to testify against the other two, and that was going to be the end of it. He was going to go to jail for, 10 years or whatever, and that was going to be the end. And they said that they had overwhelming DNA evidence against these three. Well, Dan told me about 3 months into it, he finds out that they have no DNA evidence, and basically the only thing they have is this false confession.
What's shocking to me, I see this over and over, is law enforcement gets presented with, they get a tip or they get a lead, or when Jesse tells them, the kids are kidnapped in the morning, and then, when that the kids went to school, he's got a low IQ, he's got no history of murder or violent crime. How do you keep going down this road? Really? I mean, I just can't understand how you keep going down that road when there's nothing linking those three, the West Memphis Three, to the crime. I would get it, like you said, if they're like, hey, we found Jesse's belt buckle there, or we found Damien's notebook there, or some personal item. There's nothing linking those three teenagers to the crime scene. And it's to me, it's such a creepy, kind of sophisticated triple murder, in the sense that you've got to first of all, you got to abduct these three kids. I can't imagine they were riding their bikes, right? Because you think that one of them would be able to get away, right? If they were riding their bikes at the time.
Here's the thing, Andy. I've talked to FBI profiler, and I've also talked to several other like law enforcement experts. They don't think that these three kids were killed out in the ditch bank, because here's one of the problems. So Christopher Byers, according to his own autopsy report, his organs were pale when he was autopsied, meaning that he had lost quite a bit of blood. The problem is that they did not find a single drop of blood out there in Robin Hood Hills. They found nothing. And so the people I've talked to, and it's universal, they all say the same thing. They said, no, these boys were killed in a house, a dwelling, a garage, a shop. They were killed somewhere, and then they were dumped out there. That was a disposal site.
So that's interesting, because, when I've had experience with, hearing about somebody hogtied, I think one of the reasons that is done is it sounds kind of crude. It makes it easier to carry that person.
Absolutely.
You can carry the body, if they're hogtied, in a much easier way than like draping them over your shoulder and, getting blood or DNA on yourself. That could explain why they're hogtied. It's still interesting that the kids were playing on bikes. I mean, it just makes sense that they would have had to have been attacked when they weren't actually biking, right? I mean, because I again would think you'd have a good chance that somebody would get away. And let's say they were killed at a house or a dwelling, they still got to take those bikes and get rid of those bikes too, right?
Oh yeah, yes they do.
So I always start when I analyze a case, I always start with the forensics. I think that's always where you have to start. And here it sounds like there's nothing forensically linking the West Memphis Three to the crime scene, correct?
Absolutely nothing. They've tested every hair that was collected for DNA at the crime scene, and you've got these three long-haired teenage boys who commit or allegedly commit this ruthless murders, and they don't find a drop of blood, not a hair, no semen, nothing from those guys.
So what I found from reading your book that obviously, is kind of like a big ticket item. Explain to me, there's a hair found on a ligature that's linked to Terry Hobbs. Can you explain that?
Sure. Inside the ligature that bound Michael Moore, which wasn't his stepson, it was another one of the other victims. They found a hair and they DNA tested it, and it was. I mean, it's like a 1 in a million. I don't remember what the percentage is chance, but it's a very very high probability that the hair belongs to Terry Hobbs. And he's admitted to me that he thought the hair was his. I mean, I think he says now publicly that it's not, and some of the people who defend that part of the argument will try to make up, they'll make up these arguments about the science that was used and all this other stuff. But the bottom line is that hair is most likely his. And then there was another hair that was found on a tree stump next to where the bodies were dumped. Now that one it's not nearly as likely. It's like a 1 in 125 chance that it could belong to his alibi witness, a guy named David Jacoby.
That hair inside the ligature is not found on his stepson Stevie, right?
No.
So you could argue, oh, well, his stepson had contact with his stepfather, or there might have been a transfer there from being in the house. It's on Michael Moore. So that makes it a lot more incriminating. The ligature is around like where on the body?
The ligatures bound the ankles to the wrist. So
this hair is between the shoelaces and the skin of either the ankles or the wrist.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's, again, I'm not one, I don't want to rush to judgment, but you got to admit that's pretty significant, right?
Yeah. I mean, the people who argue against the significance of that, Andy, I don't think they understand that in and of itself would probably be enough to order a new trial.
In my Starved Rock Murders case, there's a hair found on one of the women's fingers, like the glove of her finger, the same finger that her fingertip got cut off, by the way. And we did DNA testing on it. It's not Chester Weger. And to me, it's like, that's proves my case. Because like, when you think of what happened to those boys or the three women in Starved Rock Murders, there's this violent crime. And at the result of all that, when the body's laying there dead, the hair is there, right? So here, the hair is between the ligature and the skin. I mean, holy cow. That sure seems powerful to me. And then what about, you had mentioned something about a hair in the book about a black male. What's all that about?
They found one hair from a black male at the crime scene. And again, I think that this is the problem with a crime scene like this, Andy, is that it's heavily traveled.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people, in and out of that creek. And so there could be some hairs that were just happenstance. It had nothing to do with the crime at all. It could have been maybe some of the workers who were, helping get the bodies out. They were clearing the ditch. So some of this stuff, could just be happenstance, evidence. But there was one, what's interesting about this story is there was one hair found from a black man at the crime scene. That same night, if you walked along, like from the creek, there's along the drainage ditch, there's almost like a levee line. And about a half a mile from there, it comes out into the parking lot of a Bojangles restaurant. And A black man showed up at that Bojangles restaurant that night, bleeding heavily, went into the women's restroom, was jamming all sorts of stuff into a toilet, had bled so badly that he took an industrial sized toilet paper roll, put it up to the wound, and it bled all the way to the core, the cardboard core. And a woman and her daughter actually went into the bathroom and saw this whole thing going on. This guy, defecating on the floor. So he had clearly been shot or stabbed. Something had happened to him. And in fact, it was so close to where the boys were reported missing that the same officer who was responding to the two of the boys who were reported missing, the same officer was actually called to this Bojangles restaurant, but she never got out of her car. And of course, they went in and cleaned up the mess after the guy left. And then the next day, they went and found some blood flakes on the wall that belonged to him, but then they lost those blood flakes before trial.
I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Oh, and then we lost it. Like, what? The only thing about that, I'll say, I don't find it very persuasive in to be related in that, I mean, the three boys didn't stab him. The three boys didn't shoot him. Like, if this had been three adults, like there'd have been signs of like a violent fight or struggle, maybe, but like it doesn't really line up with, there's really no reason that the killer or killers would be hurt, right? In this encounter.
No, but here's the thing, Andy, I agree with you 100%. Well, let's say a killer kills these three kids inside a house, hypothetically. You need help moving the body. So you call a druggie friend or somebody that's, has a criminal background to come help you move the bodies. And then once they're moved, the first rule of assassination is you get rid of the assassins. And so what happens if somebody turns around and shoots him and, or stabs him, just to keep him quiet?
That's a good point. And one of my mottos is I always say, you never know exactly how it happened. Like there could be the weirdest thing in the world that happened and you could have just never predicted it or thought about it. Even when you say the lack of blood, I mean, I'm not so quick to rule out the crime scene being by the drainage ditch in that. Let's just say a killer stumbles upon the three kids. Let's just say their bikes are there and they're sitting down and they're looking at rocks. If somebody came and smacked them over the head with a baseball bat and then threw them in the water, I don't know if there'd be blood at the crime scene or much blood at the crime scene. Like, I think what's overrated is people always expect there to be a lot of blood. We just did an episode with Gilbert King, who's got a great podcast called Bone Valley. If you haven't checked it out, check it out. About the murder of this guy, Michelle Schofield, who got stabbed 26 times. It's about the wrongful conviction of her husband, Leo Schofield, who got charged with the murder. Anyway, he was saying that he talked to some, blood experts who said, you could have a stabbing, a violent stabbing, and the blood could all be contained within the clothing. Like, it doesn't have to be just gushing out like, a Monty Python skit, So, I hear what you're saying. Probably, and I would defer to the experts, but I wouldn't necessarily rule out that the boy, it seems to me, just on the little part, again, I have enough knowledge to be dangerous. It seems to me like it's more likely that the boys are in the woods playing. Somebody stumbles upon them, kills them, and dumps them right in the creek there, as opposed to, a dwelling and taking them. Then you got to transport the kids and their bikes out there. You got to get them there. To counter my own argument, if they're killed by the creek, there's really no reason to hog tie them. That sure is awfully weird. Is there any other forensics that were found? Is there any other evidence that was found that was not tested that potentially could be tested?
Well, Andy, it's funny you should mention that because a couple of years ago, Damian Eccles petitioned the state to do some touch DNA testing on ligatures that bound the boys.
Absolutely.
And the state has fought that. A judge has already denied it once.
What?
And you're going to really love this line of thinking from the judge. So in Arkansas, there is a provision that allows for techniques in DNA testing improve. If you've been convicted of a crime and you want to try to prove your innocence, then there is a statute that will allow you to do that. However, the judge in this case ruled that because Damian Eccles is no longer in prison essentially she said that the only punishment is being incarcerated. So if he was incarcerated, they would allow for it. But because he's not, and as I've talked to several people, technically being convicted of heinously killing 3 kids, there are punishments that go beyond the jail sentence.
Well, that's outrageous. And what I say to that is, put aside the judge, put aside the courts. I would take that. I would take that right to the state's attorney's office, whoever's the state's attorney now, and say, look, we want justice. We want to know who actually killed these 3 boys. The West Memphis Three are still living under the stain of having done it. I mean, they got released from prison. They weren't technically exonerated. It was Alford pleas, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's probably still a lot of people that are, still think they did it, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I just don't understand. I mean, right now, if I was the state's attorney in that jurisdiction, I would say, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. I still think there should be, oh my God, I could do a whole podcast episode about this. I just recorded an episode on my Star Rock Murders one, came out yesterday, where I'm trying to replace the state's attorney's office because they're just not doing any investigation. And I've seen this before. State's attorneys oftentimes just do not have an interest in getting to the truth, even though it wasn't done on their watch, even though the guys in office now aren't the guys who prosecuted the West Memphis Three. Why would you be opposed to testing all the evidence? I would say, hey, let's look at everything. Let's decide what can be tested. Let's get the results. Then we can debate perhaps what the relevance or significance is. But I mean, if you've got touch DNA and the ligatures, those still exist, those ligatures, those shoelaces?
Oh, yeah. And I'll tell you, I was actually eating lunch. This guy was appointed, a guy named Keith Cressman was appointed as the prosecutor because the prosecutor who let the West Memphis Three out, Scott Ellington, he won a special election to become a judge. So the governor appointed a new prosecutor. I was eating lunch with him one day, and this is in April of 2021. And while we're sitting there, I asked him about, because Damien had filed this petition to have these ligatures tested. And I said, so are you going to allow for it? And he said, no. He goes, I'm gonna ask a judge to order the evidence destroyed.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I looked at him.
What?
And I said,
oh my God.
And I said, really? And he goes,
Why?
yeah. He said, well, because there was a 10-year,
no,
basically like a 10-year probationary period after they were released.
Bullshit.
And that was going to be up. And he said, as soon as it was up, and I said, I understand that technically in cases that are not, if it's capital murder, they have to keep the evidence forever. But if it's any other, they don't have to keep it. They have to destroy it at some point. And I said, I understand that's the technical procedure, but do you want to do that in this case? And he said, yeah. He goes, I'm done with it, blah, blah, blah. Well, then the story came out that they lost all the evidence, that it got burned up in a fire and all these other things. Well, finally, Damien Echols' attorneys in December of that year finally got a judge to order the West Memphis Police Department basically to open up their evidence room. And so his attorneys went in there, and sitting on a table right next to the doors was all the evidence from the original trial, including the ligatures. Everything was sitting right there. And 10 minutes later, the police chief in West Memphis resigned.
But as we sit here today, right now, those shoelaces still exist?
They do.
Oh my God. If I'm willing to help. If anybody needs some help on trying to get access to those shoelaces, let me know. I'm willing to do this to help, do whatever I can, because that's outrageous to me. It's not a matter of going to the courts or going to the judge. I don't care what, it's about justice. And to me, there is an obligation to try to get justice in this case for those 3 boys. Put aside the West Memphis Three. Obviously, they deserve justice. But what about Stevie Branch, Micah Moore, and Christopher Byers and their families? I mean, and you could not have better evidence to test than the shoelaces, which obviously would have been you had to have handled those and touched those. Now, I don't know how that's affected by the conditions and the water and all that. It may not work, but that's no reason not to try. And I don't care what your statutes and rules are on destruction of evidence. Not in this case. I mean, I'm pretty sure in Chicago, they have to keep evidence in all murder cases. Like it's just, to have it available to test. Let's say there are advances in DNA technology or whatnot. That blows my mind. This came to light. When did he file that motion?
He first filed to have the touch DNA testing done in March of 2020, and right now the issue is before the Arkansas Supreme Court. They are the ones that will decide
Oh,
it.
it's still pending.
Still pending, yes.
Wow. Keep me posted. I am super interested in that.
Oh, and Andy, I'll tell you this. I talked to Jared Bradley. He's the CEO of MVAC DNA testing. I said, what piece of evidence in that case would you want to test if you could? And he immediately said, the shoelaces. And I said, why? He said, because when the killer was tying those knots, he was pulling skin cells off and it was getting embedded in those shoelaces, and shoelaces are rough. And he said it's likely that some of that DNA could have survived the conditions being in the water, that it would have embedded into the shoelace. And so he said he thought of all the evidence that would probably be the most forensically valuable.
Wow. I had one other question I forgot to ask on that hair that you're saying statistically looks like it's Terry Hobbs's hair.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it not like they could get a full STR nuclear DNA profile to definitively say it's him?
It was tested in 2007, so I don't think that the technology had advanced enough. And technically, the state has a conviction in this case, so they're not going to be spending money and resources testing other pieces of evidence. In fact, Damien Eccles on this touch DNA testing has already volunteered to pay for it.
I mean, yes and no. I think in a case where of this magnitude where you're trying to solve it, right? To me, it's still like a cold case. Yeah, the state has to expend resources. I'm sorry. Yeah, the state has to pay for some testing. They should. Now, at some point, we can debate when that point is, like how much is enough. But I feel like they should pay for that, for not only to test the ligatures. Now in 2023, let's test that hair again,
Mm-hmm.
and let's find out conclusively if it's Terry Hobbs's hair or not. I mean, and if the state wouldn't do that, I bet you the West Memphis Three can raise money through a GoFundMe or something to do all that testing. They could probably raise that in a day. I'd contribute.
Yeah.
In terms of suspects, and we'll phrase it in terms of suspects. Who in your mind are the suspects?
When we say suspects, I don't even know like who to even begin with, because
And I don't want to get you in trouble for any kind of defamation here, so we won't have to say it like who are the police, like who has been looked at, or how do you want to say it?
well, I'll tell you who has been interviewed. How's that?
Let's do that. Who's been interviewed?
John Mark Byers, one of the stepdads, he was interviewed. But as I told West Memphis Three supporters in the past, he actually died in a car wreck a couple of years ago. And I've interviewed John Mark Byers many times. The problem with him as a suspect was his whereabouts are pretty concretely verified throughout the night, and he's the first person to notify the police that his stepson was missing.
Okay.
And then another guy that was interviewed, obviously, was Terry Hobbs.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason, Hobbs was interviewed is because, that hair was found in 2007. And then
Right.
Natalie Maines from the Dixie Chicks got up on, she came in for a rally. And of course, she's a big supporter of theirs. And she said that they need to go after the real, killer in this case. And she mentioned Hobbs's name.
Yeah. I saw that. And then he brought a defamation suit that she won, right?
She won. Yeah. I mean, and I talked to her about it, and I was like, aren't you scared now that he's suing you? And she smiled and she said, no, I think he just fell into our trap.
Right. Because now you got to give a deposition. I read that you talk about that in your book.
Yes.
Well, I mean, if your hair is found between the ligature, the shoelaces, and the skin, yes. Okay. You're going to be a suspect. I mean, that is going to be your first lead. That's going to be where you start. So that just has to be. I know you have interviewed him. You probably have talked to him more than anybody, I would imagine.
Probably in the media, I would say yes, because I've interviewed him back in the day. I interviewed him several times. He would just call me randomly. And then obviously you saw the interview I did of him for CrimeCon. And of course, you were in the audience and you heard him say that he hopes a judge does the right thing and orders the evidence destroyed.
That's crazy. What was he like? What was your impression of him?
He's a personable guy. I mean, I've talked. I mean, the last time I talked to him, we were on the phone probably for an hour. I will tell you this: he was not happy after CrimeCon. He called me up and was complaining about that. But I
Mm.
mean, I told him, I said, "Well, what did you agree to?" And I told him, I said, "Listen, if you didn't have anything to do with this, you know, you got to quit. You need to quit talking in the public because you make yourself sound guilty when you talk.
Mm.
You know, anybody that says they want a judge to order the evidence destroyed in a capital
No.
murder case where 3 little boys were murdered."
All you would be saying is, I want justice. I want to solve this till the day I die, not, oh, destroy the evidence.
Yeah. And he said it not just to me. He also told a friend of mine who's a podcaster. You know, he did an episode with him, and he said it. I mean, this was his exact quote: "I hope a judge does the right thing and orders the evidence destroyed." And when I asked him the first time he said this to me, I said, "Why would you say that?" He said, "Well, if the West Memphis Three want it tested, I don't." And I was like, and this is what he understand is that he's getting barbecued on social media and everywhere else because a bunch of people think he had something to do with it. He has as much reason, if he didn't do it, to want the evidence tested as they do.
It's super, super significant evidence that there's a hair that is likely his that is found between the shoelace and the skin of Michael Moore. Like, I'm sorry, but that is very, very incriminating. Doesn't mean he did it, but obviously he's going to be on your list of people that have to be thoroughly investigated.
Andy, I want to tell you something that I find this is like insane to me. But I'm on a lot of West Memphis Three pages, you know, from people who think they did it or people who think they're innocent. And there's actually this argument circulating among people who think that those 3 guys are guilty, that even if they test those ligatures and they find Hobbs or some other person's DNA, that maybe he just bent down and like tied all 3 of their shoes. And I'm sitting here going, who in
Okay.
the world ties an 8-year-old
Yeah.
shoes, even their own kid? Like when my kids were 8, I would never do that. And I've never tied the shoestrings of another person's kid. No one would do that. And here's what's
No.
crazy, Andy. They have already accepted the fact that if they test those shoestrings, that the 3 guys who were convicted, they won't find their DNA. They've accepted that fact. How crazy is that?
You know, I will say this, you know, if I hadn't heard about that hair on the ligature, I would be more skeptical of it being, let's just say, a family member, meaning there could be a motive, you know, if somebody is abusive towards their own child, um, you know, but here, you know, all 3 boys were killed, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's not like just one boy was killed. All 3 were killed. Why? Why were 3 killed? In me, just my gut, if you take that hair out of the equation, and you told me at the start, it's this transient area, truck stops, blah, blah, blah. It's a triple murder. The kids are naked, you know. It strikes me as being more consistent. And I'm, you know, who am I? I'm just giving you my opinion, but strikes me being more consistent with kind of like a random transient, you know, violent person that's out in the woods, as opposed to a family member. But that hair found in the ligature is a game changer and is, you know, you got to go down that road now and you got to fully investigate that. And I mean, you don't stop now. So what's next? Where does this case stand? We've got this testing of the shoelaces that's in the Supreme Court. Is there anything else going on now besides that?
No, that's kind of where the case is at a standstill. And Andy, you'll probably remember this, but when I gave that presentation at CrimeCon, Jim Clemente, who was a leader in the FBI's behavioral analyst unit for years, he made a point to me that when I thought about this case, I'd never thought about it quite this way. He said, in all of human history, recorded history, we can find no instance where 3 teenagers killed 3 kids, right? Like it's never happened before, and it never happened since this time, right?
Really?
No case like this. He said it's unique in all of recorded history. He said, how many times has someone been killed and then someone else or someone's else had to be killed to keep it quiet?
Yep.
So he said, it's almost as if we need to look at this as one of these kids was the target and the other two were just collateral damage.
It's a perfect way to kind of like, start to wrap this up because in my Starved Rock murders case, 3 women from Chicago in their 50s came down to Starved Rock State Park for a hike. The 3 women were found bludgeoned to death in a shallow cave. And I had a woman reach out to me to say, my grandfather told me what happened. He was in the Chicago Mafia. One of the husbands wanted his wife killed, hired the Chicago Mafia to do it. They came down there to kill this one woman, and the other 2 women were collateral damage. And because of that, everybody looked at the case as like, oh, this wild psycho killer killed these 3 ladies. Nobody was thinking that one particular woman got targeted, right?
Right. It's so eerie to me, Andy, how the Starved Rock murders and this case have some
They have a lot in common.
distinct similarities. Yeah.
I'll tell you another thing. You talked about like the state wants to destroy the evidence in that case. In my case, okay, when I first, got involved, the Will County State's Attorney's Office got appointed as a special prosecutor. And I said to them, I said, hey, I'd like to just look at the physical evidence, meaning like, like just with my eyeballs, an evidence inspection. Let's put it all on the table. Well, what happened was the state's attorney from Will County went and looked at the evidence on his own, got back to me and told me, no, Andy, I'm not going to agree to that. The evidence is a complete disaster. That's what he said. Complete disaster. There's no point in you looking at it. And I said, well, if it's a complete disaster, I mean, just let me look at it. He's like, no, I don't think, sorry. I had to file a motion with the court to ask for permission. The judge allowed me to do it. I hired this company called Microtrace. They're like the world's foremost microscopists. They look at things under a microscope. Anyway, they came out there. We got access to the evidence. They took like 2,000 photographs. George, the evidence was amazing. There were so many hairs and things under glass slides, completely, perfectly preserved. I mean, this guy just totally misrepresented the state of the evidence to me. Why? In my opinion, he didn't want me to look at it. And I just think there are so many similarities to it. You've got a false confession. You've got somebody young. You've got a bogus confession. You've got forensics that link to somebody else. You got no forensics linked into people charged. All that is true.
Andy, let me tell you a really super quick story that will just to give you an insight into the mind of Jesse Misskelley Jr. So a couple years ago, I get a text message from somebody, and it was a mugshot of Jesse Misskelley Jr. being held at the Crittenden County Jail, and that's where he lives, the county he lives in. And he had been arrested at that weekend, and I called the prosecutor because basically if these guys get caught for jaywalking, they can go back to prison for 10 years.
Yeah.
And so I called the prosecutor, and I'm like, so I couldn't see what he was charged with. And so I called the prosecutor on his personal cell phone. I said, hey, I heard Jesse's in jail. What is his charges? And he said, well, he was out driving without a driver's license, without a license plate, with no proof of insurance, at night with no headlights that worked in his truck. And I said, what? And he goes, yeah, he was driving at night with no headlights, no license plate, no driver's license, no insurance. A guy that can go to prison for literally jaywalking for 10 more years was out doing this. And guess what I found out, Andy, after this? He had not done this once. He had not done this twice. He had been caught 3 separate times through the years driving at night with no license, no headlights, and no license plate on his car.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. How bizarre. Is this after he got released?
Yeah, this was recent.
Take Jesse, who you just described as having all these issues, and these guys commit the perfect crime. These guys commit a triple murder, hogtie these 3 little boys, and leave no DNA, no blood, and nobody sees them kill the kids. Nobody sees them do anything. Nobody sees them go into the woods, come out of the woods. I mean, not only no forensics, no witnesses. These 3 teenage, boys pull off the perfect triple murder. The kid who's driving with no lights, no insurance, all that, with a 72 IQ. Really? They're the ones who did it? Wow.
Yeah, Andy, when you say it out loud like that, it almost sounds ludicrous.
Well, it is ludicrous. I mean, it is ludicrous. I mean, in my Starved Rock murders case, Chester Uyghur's the 21-year-old uneducated dishwasher, on his work break. Okay. And his confession is he's out walking in this beautiful canyon, sees these three ladies on a hike, decides to rob them, thinks that's a great idea, grabs for what he thinks is a purse. It's actually a binoculars case. There's a verbal altercation. They kind of decide to like part ways when the women attack Chester Weger. He then has to defend himself, kills one, has to kill all three, and not with one blow, with like, I mean, they're beaten. Their faces are unrecognizable. They're beaten like in a frenzy. And then guess what, George? He goes back to work as a dishwasher. He goes back to his job. Tell me another case where somebody committed this violent triple murder on their work break, okay, and then just went back to their job, and nobody batted an eye. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Oh, and Andy, by the way, just so we're clear, so Jesse and Damien had dropped out of high school, but Jason was still in high school. The next day after the murders on May 6, 1993, he goes to school. He takes an English test and an art test and makes an A on both tests. And both of those teachers testified at the Rule 37, and they both walked up to him and put their hand on his face. And,
wow,
you know, like when he was sitting there at the defense table, because it's absolutely asinine. And again, another similarity to the Starved Rock murders.
We're going to have to do a part 2, George. We're going to have to do a part 2. We're going to have to give an update with West Memphis 3. I'll give you an update with Starved Rock murders. We'll definitely do this. Let's let it breathe. Give it a couple months. See if we get some updates. I'm sure you're going to continue to cover the case, correct?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I actually went and ate dinner with Damian Eccles the night before he went before the judge that denied the petition.
Wow.
Yeah. I was with him and his lawyers.
Please keep me posted. I am super interested in the issue of testing these shoelaces. I think it's an outrage that the state's attorney's office wouldn't just agree to do that. Everybody wants the same thing: justice, the truth. So to make the argument you want the evidence to be destroyed is outlandish. I also know you've got a podcast, Diamond State Murder Board. Are you still cranking out episodes on that?
Oh, yes. And we do cases from Arkansas that I've had some direct involvement with, but I'm also involved in several cases around the country. So we do, it's kind of a raw form podcast. We just start recording. We don't do a lot of heavy editing.
Diamond State Murder Board. I'm gonna check that out. Well, it's been great talking to you. I could talk for another 2 hours. Thank you so much for coming on with me. And again, let's stay in touch. I think there's going to be some updates that we're going to get into.
Oh, Andy, you call me anytime. I'm down for anything.
All right.